Welcome, everyone. All right, thank you so much for coming. My name is Wes Gilmore. I'm the coalition lead for Evergreen Action. And Evergreen is a new organization that formed in 2019. A group of former JNC for America staff and supporters who came together to support a all-out national climate organization. And at the heart of that organization has been a strong sexual statements, own public investments, and environmental justice. And after just 2 short years, I'm really proud to be here to see the time that the U.S. is so close to on that vision. And the private sector has a really big role to play in that national climate conversation. And so today's event will be webcasts, and we'll be taking questions from the audience via Twitter. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use your hashtag Galvanize. The questions will be submitted in advance, and I'll be back on the stage to answer those questions and ask them to Gina. And please also feel free to include social media handles at Gina McCarthy 26, at Tom Steyer, and at Galvanize. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing 2 powerful climate leaders in the U.S. First, Tom Steiger is a successful investor, business leader, and philanthropist, former Democratic presidential candidate, activist, and co-executive chair of Galvanize Climate Solutions. And I'm sure there's probably a million other things in there. A mission-driven investment platform. So Galvanize Climate Solutions is a mission-driven investment platform. So we focus on mobilizing and deploying the capital and expertise to accelerate important and accurate climate solutions. And it's also pledged to contribute a significant portion of those profits towards climate justice organizations. And next, the woman who truly needs our production. Gina McCarthy is an American environmental health and air quality expert who is serving as the first White House National Climate Advisor under the U.S. President Joseph Biden. And she served as the 13th Administrator in the Environmental Protection Agency until 2017 under U.S. President Obama. So let's kick things off here. Gina, this is the first COP. The U.S. has really been back at it, at least since COP22 in 2016 at the end of the Obama presidency. And so we'd like to know how COP is going so far, and what do you see as some of the main things that you'd like to see the U.S. happen?
Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction. First of all, thank you for the introduction. Nice job. And thanks, everybody, for joining. I think the most important thing that the United States wanted to accomplish was to make sure that the world understood that the United States was back. You know, we are part of the Paris Agreement. President Biden ran on a climate agenda, and he won on the climate agenda because the people of the United States want us back, because they recognize the challenges that we are facing. They can see them and feel them and taste them. And so it was our job to make sure that we're here talking about the work that's ongoing now in the United States that really represents all of the work that states and cities have been doing and the federal government doing under President Obama and now, and how we continue to see a movement towards clean energy like we never had anticipated before. So we're here to talk about that, but also to rejoin not in a leadership position, but in a partnership position. The president came with significant resources and commitment to help support the developing world. We have new initiatives that are going to invest in resilience and adaptation in other countries as well. So we're recognizing our outsized responsibility and coming here intending to meet that responsibility. And by doing that, hopefully get the world to not just recognize that the United States is back, but that there is a path forward that we all must take together, and that we have to do it in partnership, support one another. And if we do, then we have an opportunity to hang on to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is really what we cannot afford to lose. Thanks.
So I would like to echo a lot of what Gina said about America's re-entering the leadership partnership, if I can put together two words she used, because the truth is we as a country did not do that badly under the Trump administration because of what states did, because of what businesses did, but the national government didn't exist in climate. So I came to a COP in Poland and I went to the American room, which was upstairs and was locked and no one was there. And that was a symbol really of where the federal government was in terms of participating in the worldwide effort to keep the world safe from our climate crisis. And so when I think about what's going on at this COP, the two things I think it's absolutely critical for the world, as well as for as an American, that we participate on the moral, economic, correct moral and economic side of this. And also that the partnership between the government and the civil society of America, the businesses, the voters, the broad structure, including the states, be rejoined. And I think that's something that is happening in a way that I've never seen before. I think under President Obama, there was a lot of leadership on climate on a world level, but I don't think we've ever seen the kind of participation from broader society and business that we're seeing at this COP in a way that I think is incredibly powerful, and I think will bring results far surpassing what anybody expects.
Tom, can I just reinforce what you just said? Because I know that you've been a leader on these issues for a long time, but you're in with a lot more company than you've had before in this effort. We have the first movers that we've pulled together, but we announced a big a global methane strategy, and we were joined by more than 100 other countries to commit to at least a 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. And at that event, you had, Larry Kramer standing up with philanthropic money already in hand to support the efforts of other countries as they try to achieve these reduction commitments. That's never happened before. It's never happened before. And so I think you and I both know that while President Trump, negated some regulations that were important environmental protections, some of which were critical to climate, it actually didn't make a big difference in the private sector because they already knew what direction the world was heading and where they needed to go. So I'm so excited that the private sector is here with such vibrancy now. I mean, there is no question any longer that this is a catastrophe waiting and we have to fix it. Now, how do we do it in a way that captures the economic value associated with it?
Well, it's funny because, so as Gina said, as a professional investor, I spend a lot of years arguing about how it's good for the economy, it's good for jobs, how it's, great for American leadership economically in the world as well as politically. And there was a lot of pushback. Really, I never thought it was based on analysis. I thought it was based on attitude from people who really wanted to keep the status quo in terms of a fossil fuel-based economy. And one of the things that's happened to me while I've been at this COP here in Glasgow is that I was talking to a banker is from one of the money center banks. So they have trillions of dollars. And he was talking about the hundreds of billions of dollars that they'd committed to clean energy lending going forward. And then he reminded me that he was a movement conservative Republican. And my point being, it goes across the spectrum, that the conversation about whether we need to do this and whether the whole point, the movement of getting us to address this climate crisis, that conversation in a very real way in the business world is over. And so that we don't have, you have Exxon talking about energy transition. You have Chevron putting out a plan about how they're going to change and how they're going to participate. And to be fair, they're doing it because it's making their stock a lot more valuable. And so they're saying this is how we create value for our shareholders. This is how we do our job best in an economic framework. And, you know, it's incredibly powerful because then you kind of get that multiplying effect, that accelerating effect of capitalism for all of us in terms of job creation. And of course, this doesn't happen without the public sector, but it's a change.
Well, at some point in time, we'll actually have to be prompted by a question, but we could go on like this forever, reinforcing one another. Let me just, you know, add that, you know, the private sector, if you're in public service, you're there to protect the people that you serve. That's what's my job at EPA: protect people from pollution, get them healthy, and do it in the most cost-effective way that you could. But the trigger that we've seen on climate is that it is such now a well-known understanding of what the science says, that the trick for us at this conference is not to acknowledge that the private sector can make money on renewable energy. It's to provide a platform to accelerate it. Now it's all about how quickly can we deploy and how much can we invest in the innovation that we will need moving forward. That's the key. That's how we catch 1.5.
So Gina, let me ask you this question. When you look, I really have two questions. One is, we know we have to accelerate the decarbonization by sector. And, you know, normally people put that in 5 sectors: electricity, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, and the built environment. So my first question is, let me get to that. The second question is, we know we need to sequester multiple gigatons of carbon every year to get to net zero. How do you think about encouraging, accelerating, promoting that kind of additional permanent sequestration of carbon to catch us to net zero as opposed to real zero?
Well, Tom, there's been a little bit of a change, I think, in the attitudes and the discussions going on. That's very healthy. You know, you've been going to COPs for a long time. I feel like I've been going since I was 10, you know, maybe I have. And it wasn't until this COP that I heard such robust discussions about natural solutions and resilience and adaptation. Because in the early years, for me, as a regulator, working at the state levels, if you talked about adaptation, you were giving in to the fact that we wouldn't mitigate to fix it. And so and now that moment's passed, right? And it's a healthy discussion now about how we have to reinvigorate our natural resources in order to bring stability on all sides of this equation. And so I think it's incredibly exciting right now. And if you look at, and forgive me, this is the first time I'm going to say Build Back Better of the next 200 times I say Build Back Better. So you can start counting them if you'd like, but it'll be rude. But anyways, if you look at Build Back Better, it doesn't stop with mitigation. It includes the variety of steps that need to be taken. This is a multifaceted problem where you can apply a lot of different solutions to it, and you have to. So it has, you know, in there, you know, a significantly beneficial tax credits that will generate clean electricity. And it's going to, in all sectors, really move the needle to show that you're the winner now. You're going to be the bigger winner the faster you go. So that's the acceleration. But it also has, you know, resilience and adaptation investments, like with smart agriculture, and like with direct investments in making our cities more resilient, and in looking at opportunities to really build adaptation through state efforts and local community efforts, because it is a partnership with those levels of government, not I have this money and I'm going to tell you how to spend it. So if you look at this, and it also is a huge commitment to meet the president's promise of doing this in an equitable way. You know, when you're reading through the list of different sectors, you can see that in each of those sectors, there have been communities left behind. And that can't continue to happen. So there is a big commitment to making sure that we're impacting environmental justice communities in the most positive way, first and foremost. So it is a spreadsheet of a variety of different ways that you can capture this. Now, sequestration to me is two different things. So let me answer the second question after having droned on too long in the first. I'll keep this so much more crisp. Sequestration to me means two different things. One is like in smart agriculture, the whole idea is to keep carbon captured in the soil. That you have to change the way in which you do agricultural practices, not just to reduce methane, which is part of the strategy that we put out yesterday, but it's to, you know, go to no-till farming, you know, figure out how to preserve the carbon and not disturb it so that it can be captured. But the other thing of sequestration is the more mechanical one of recognizing that you have industries that really have, in many cases, limited ability to actually reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. In some cases, with significant investment, they can. But if you do capture the carbon that comes off and sequester it, you can actually find ways to put that carbon into the ground permanently. And so all of those areas are being invested in pretty heavily, mainly CCUS for where you have very difficult sectors to really immediately shift. And so I think we're pretty excited about the opportunities, frankly, in all of them. You know, I think there's opportunities in agriculture that are unbounded, frankly, but there's also opportunities on public lands, you know, and opportunities for conservation, which is what America the Beautiful, our 30 by 30 campaign is, which is a really good.
Yeah.
You have to admit, it's hard to disagree with America the Beautiful, but it's about preserving and protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. And that's going to be an essential part of this.
So let me say this. You know, for the last 9 months, I've started a company with an old investing friend of mine named Catherine Hall, who basically to invest in climate solutions.
She's an old friend. You're not suggesting she's old.
Well, she's just about the same age as me, so I know for a fact she's not old. But what that means is, I mean, we're investing just in the kinds of things that can come up with scalable solutions for this crisis. And it means we get to meet a lot of entrepreneurs. It means that we go out and the people who are coming up with a new technology to sequester carbon, a new technology to store energy, a new technology in terms of agriculture, which, believe it or not, there is a lot of incredible work, innovative work being done in ag, because people don't like to think about it this way, but it's very much of a business. And what we can see, you know, I was talking to a guy this morning who's using satellite technology and artificial intelligence to talk about measuring the sequestering of carbon and then starting a market so people can get paid to do it, measure every year, pay people, and then have the companies who are in fact emitting carbon pay for their, basically pay to get to net zero by enabling these people to store it themselves. So we're seeing incredible the kinds of things that Americans like to believe about ourselves, which in fact are true. We're very innovative, you know, we're very hardworking, we're very entrepreneurial, and we're seeing that happen as a result of this investment company at a level which is both incredibly fun and exciting, but also very reassuring. Because when you hear about this problem, it sounds like it's so big. You know, there are people out there who say it's so big we shouldn't even try. And that to me is such a mistake for Americans, because it's so big that it's exactly the kind of problem that we're great at. And that all the things that the Biden administration is pushing for is to encourage that kind of American know-how and, you know, entrepreneurship to come up with the things that will explode in a good way to address these issues.
You know, and the only other thing I'd mention as a follow-up on this is that one of the things that I worry about the most, and I'm not particularly a worrier, but we're seeing some not such great changes happening. One is the drought that I'm seeing. You know, the drought in the Western US was just extraordinary. And I don't think it's oh, that was just this year, next year we'll be fine. And for farming, if you don't invest in our agriculture, you know, we are threatening our own food supply, never mind the world's food supply. And so we have to have those types of technologies. Similarly to looking at carbon sequestration, there is incredible opportunity to reduce water use in farms with the technologies of today, where they can tell you exactly, using different types of systems like drones, on where you need to actually water and when to maximize your yield. And if we fail to capture those things, then shame on us, because we're actually creating those technologies here and they're being used elsewhere already. And so it's really exciting opportunities now, and not just for big ag. These can be applicable to small farms. So because we have to protect our family farms. That's part of our culture. And so we do have to just turn this challenge into just creative opportunity. And all that will make money, and God bless America. That's what I say. I've never made it, but somebody does. So.
Well, just to put that in a little bit of perspective, about a fifth of the greenhouse gas emissions from the United States of America come from agriculture. And I think people don't know that. And what is also true is that agriculture presents some of the strongest opportunities for sequestering carbon if we do things differently, if we do things smarter, if we use new technologies. So that, and I looked at the Build Back Better plan, and it has a huge allocation to agriculture and to forestry. And I think it really reflects the society-wide approach which that plan is taking, both from a human justice standpoint, but also to cover all the different sectors of American business. So let me ask you this one, Gina.
Yeah.
When you think about this, what is the first thing that you think has to happen in size for us to meet our 50% reduction by 2030, the NDC?
I think part of it is, well, there's a lot of different ways to get there. I mean, I think we limit ourselves by thinking there's any one. And one of the reasons why the Build Back Better plan, second or third time, is actually so engaging, is that it hits all sectors. It provides a mechanism for change. And I know that a lot of people have said, oh, it's a lot of money. Of course, $555 billion is a lot of money. But we lost $100 billion last year in just responding to wildfires and droughts and heat and other disasters, where we still lost lives, and we still lost property, and we still lost our forests and our farmlands. You know, and so it's unacceptable to think that this is such a significant investment that we shouldn't make it. It's a significant investment, well designed to actually attract the kind of business discussions that you're having, Tom, because it's not going to solve it, but it's going to spark it. It's going to make things happen in each sector. And I actually was delighted when President Biden in his first day also said, hey, we're going to get to clean electricity in 2035. That to me is one of the biggest changes. We have to get to clean electricity in 2035.
That was a very aggressive statement.
Wasn't it?
Absolutely. As someone from California, where we like to think that we're going to be aggressive on policy, and we've been pretty aggressive relative to everybody else. When President Biden said 2035, California was 2045. So it was like, oh my goodness, we thought we were ahead.
Well, I think we planned it that way because finally we need to get ahead of California on something. But it was that, and and we learned a lot, I think, in one of the early sectoral efforts that we took was electric vehicles, which of course we were working with California all the way. But that was a learning experience, I think, because it was one where, we first broached the subject with the auto workers and the automakers. And the challenge we had with the auto workers was that electric vehicles, if we don't start manufacturing here and at scale, the electric vehicles don't need as many workers. And so the challenge was to do this in a way where we actually sparked production, where we actually started investing in new battery storage technologies and other things that would be a companion to some of the work that was being done. And so when we started to think more holistically about President Biden's framing, where we're going to get to a clean energy future, but we're going to do it sparking really good paying union jobs, it changed the dynamic of the discussion. It made it really challenging, but in the best way possible, to show that it had to be ingrained into the economy. We had to think about this more. And the discussion became, with the car companies, you have lots of opportunity to move forward with electric vehicles. What do we do to tell you that if you invest in the United States and start manufacturing here, start manufacturing batteries here, then we can get to scale and convince our workers that they're not going to be left behind. They're going to be advantaged. And it became the framing for everything else.
Of course, the other thing that was going on, Gina, was that Tesla was worth about 10 times more than Ford or GM. And the people who are running Ford and GM happened to notice that, in fact, they were worth 1/10 of a startup electric vehicle company. And they thought, that really stinks. What can we do to change that around? And I think the other thing that is absolutely true here is this is a global problem. The Europeans are building electric vehicles. The Chinese are building lots of electric vehicles. As a country, it's kind of lead, follow, or get out of the way.
Yep.
And so Americans have never been great about the last two. So we want to participate in a real way, because that's the thing that's the economic driver for us that you're talking about, Gina.
Yeah. And I think it really didn't help. Hurt, I should say, when Ford was building an electric F-150 truck. Because the thing we need to do with all of these products that are new and better, which is what electric vehicles are. If you haven't driven one, please do, because you'll be just hooked. They're unbelievable. But what's happening is that it just put a new context on it, that it wasn't just about city dwellers and it wasn't just about California. These are vehicles that can perform better for all of the things you want a truck to do. And so it changes the dynamics when you try to get climate not as something that is demanding better things for products for people who can't afford them or can't use them or can't access them. And so part of the number 4 or 5, Build Back Better, is actually consumer credits and rebates. Because if we're true to our challenge to actually address environmental justice, it's not just getting electric vehicles in our urban areas, it's getting in the rural communities that need access as well. And it's not, just about cleaning the air with good school buses out in the burbs. It's in the cities. It's because we need electric school buses and transit buses so people can get around, not needing single use, vehicles, single occupancy vehicles. So there's all kinds of ways that I think we can build this in the fabric of people's lives in a way that will make them realize that there's no sacrifice. These are truly investments, not costs.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we're really seeing in the private sector right now, and you can see it in the paper all the time, is not just corporations who've been pushing back against this. I mean, GM and Ford were not talking about electric vehicles 2 years ago. They have made a huge move here, but we're also seeing a huge influx of money and talent into clean energy. Young people, young entrepreneurs, young skilled workers who want to work in it because it makes sense to them, not just in terms of a paycheck, but in terms of the meaning of their job content. And so we're actually seeing the kind of explosion in this area that we saw in telephony and into IT around the end of the last century. When you think about it, we had no real changes in telephones for almost a century until they got deregulated, and all of a sudden everything changes. Why did it change? Because a whole bunch of money came in, a whole bunch of new ideas came in, and all kinds of technology just blew out and changed into ways that no one could imagine. That's what I honestly believe we're seeing now, an internet kind of revolution, where there will be things that we've never expected, we hadn't imagined, the gamification of the net. I mean, those were words that didn't exist 20 years ago. And I expect we're going to see things like that, where there are going to be new ideas coming through that we'll just assume make sense, and we hadn't thought of them 2 years before.
That's the kind of message of hope that you need when you have a world that's been in their house for 2 years suffering from a pandemic. I'm dead serious. The great thing about this conference is it's forward leaning. It's talking about what we need to do now to protect people, but it is talking about the promise of the future. And the country that really looks at this as an opportunity is gonna win. It's going to win the economic value associated with that, and it's going to help us reinvigorate some of the places in our cities that haven't been invested in for a really long time. And it's going to make our rural communities get the broadband access, high-speed broadband access they need. You cannot have an economy without it. One of the interesting things is you were talking about sequestration, Tom, and there's a lot of debate about the value of carbon capture and sequestration, but there's significant investments in it. And let me tell you what it's sparking. It's an interesting conversation, because one of the big challenges, if you really, the framing that the president has put on this is you got to grow jobs, they got to be union accessible, we've got to get some really high paying jobs that allow people to sort of have access to the middle class. We just keep growing in poverty and not the middle class. And so it's time that has to shift. If you want a strong democracy, that's what you do. You make sure that you can keep moving people up. And the conversation began, what do we do with the workers left behind? That's one of the most challenging questions is how do you grow jobs that are going to be accessible to workers that are in this energy transition, workers depending upon a big coal utility to survive. Their very culture is around it, or coal mines and other things. When we know coal is really moving away, it is not going to be the energy of the future. But how do we deal with it and deal with allowing communities to continue to thrive? And so there's investment in here that takes a look at really routine infrastructure like water quality infrastructure, but it also looks at how we deal with the old oil and gas wells and close them once and for all. We have hundreds of thousands of these things spewing methane. It's looking at how we deal with coal mines, which are spewing methane as well as a number of contaminants that I know too well, for sure. And then, and we're also looking at what are the areas of growth if we were to invest in industry and cleaning industry. What are the areas where we can recapture manufacturing again and spark growth in areas that have been really desperate for more job growth opportunities? And so we've been focused on literally identifying pockets where we're trying to attract investment that will actually invest in CCUS for an industry in a way that's going to allow us to clean it up, grow more, produce more, and add jobs in those areas. Areas like the Ohio River Valley. It's been struggling for so long. How do we deal with this? Is it hydrogen and a nice clean hydrolysis-based hydrogen, or is it CCUS? But we have to do something unique in areas left behind, and there's a huge amount of resources that have already been dedicated to this. West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania and Kentucky rather, and it's in areas in Pennsylvania that need some help. And we've identified them, and we can know that there's a system that can be developed to actually make this work, but we have to attract manufacturing back to the United States again.
But let me just talk about this for a second, because I think it really reflects on how important this Build Back Better plan is. Because Gina was just talking about the Ohio River Valley. And I don't know how much time you guys have spent in Ohio, but I remember going to Ohio in 2013. And they had believe it or not, very vibrant, clean energy manufacturing capability, because in fact, Ohio traditionally has had a great manufacturing capability because they've been suppliers to Detroit and the car industry. So they had great engineers, they had great facilities, and they were actually one of the centers in the United States of manufacturing clean energy. And the Koch brothers went in there and they pushed the legislature to pass legislation to prevent that kind of manufacturing in Ohio. They forced every Republican to vote for it, and they killed the clean energy manufacturing base in Ohio, and it hasn't come back to date. And if in fact you go through some of those towns that actually have capability, so I mean, I'm from California, and Californians like to think we're smart. And a lot of times people don't like it about us. But I can tell you that going through Ohio and seeing the capability that those companies and those working people and those managers had was very, very impressive. And then to see it gutted intentionally by policy, basically cutting them off from a big future industry intentionally so that we'd all be stuck in a fossil fuel world was one of the most it really points out how important it is for the public sector and the private sector to hold hands together to make this happen.
And it opened the floodgates
You remember
to
that?
other countries. I'm really, you'd think I would be good at this by now. You're wrong. It's how I hold it up. Jeez. What were we just talking
Ohio
about?
River Valley.
Well, that might be a good time to
and
jump in with some audience
I'm
questions.
sorry?
Oh, that might be a good time to jump in with some audience questions.
Oh, can I just answer this and then we'll be it right? We're being so rude, filibustering ourselves. I will do it in one second. It's opened up the floodgates for products in other countries that came in that are much dirtier in terms of their production and much less high performing than what people in the United States manufacture. Can I just add one more thing? I don't know whether you've heard this, Tom, because I think we did a terrible job actually rolling this out. So I'm going to try it one more time. Is if you remember, the EU and the US had tariff issues going back and forth.
Of course.
Of late, that started with President Trump. And we negotiated and just finished negotiating a couple of days ago an agreement for the first ever carbon intensity based trade agreement. It's exactly what you'd want to do.
It's exactly what, yeah, I get it.
Right?
Totally.
We have some incredible people working in our climate office and some incredible people working in the National Security Council and the various folks, Ambassador Ty and Gina Raimondo in particular at Commerce, we just put a spark in their eye and said, you know what, we're being flooded with dirty stuff. If we raise the bar and say, okay, we'll do this in a way that basically benefits low carbon aluminum and steel production, and we give them the benefit that we're now just not even accommodating anymore. And instead, it basically requires that the higher carbon intensity not be benefited by this trade arrangement. Things can change everywhere on that very issue.
So, and let me, can I say this, Wes? You know, people always ask, is there, you know, is this industrial policy, which, you know, can be often dirty words in the American economy, to which I would say, is it industrial policy to let people pollute for free? Or is it industrial policy to charge people the cost of their pollution to everybody else in society? Sorry, Wes.
No, that's a really good point, Tom. We are definitely already feeling the effects of inaction and of polluting right now, and we have to invest as much as we can. And that, along with some of your conversation about communities that are left behind, brings me to another question, which is that Galvanize has promised to contribute a significant portion of its profits to climate justice organizations, and wanted you to talk a little bit about how you came about thinking about how do you think about investing in climate justice? What does that process look like, and what made you decide to have that as a part of your business plan, which could be good for other firms to model?
So I want to harken back to start with what Gina said, which is that the Build Back Better plan has environmental justice at the heart of what it's doing. And let me say this, I have been working politically on climate for over a decade. I co-chaired with George Shultz a proposition in California in 2010 that got 70% of the vote, and which was, we said from the beginning, it's about jobs and environmental justice. And I believe that California has successfully had great policy, accurate policy, just policy, by starting in the communities where the pollution is most highly concentrated, with the leadership from those communities who understand fully what the health costs to the community and particularly to children are. And that if you don't start with that value system and those people and those communities, you get the wrong policy and you get the wrong coalition. And so when we think about business, we're also incredibly interested in businesses that will scale in a way that works, galvanize climate solutions. So it's really important, in my opinion, for us, not just in terms of giving back to the community, although we're deliberately doing that, to about 25% of our distributed profits, to give back, to make sure that people understand this is about solutions. But if you're going to have a scalable, important solution, before you decide to invest in it, you have to be asking yourself, is this going to be a just outcome for society? And do we have a team at Galvanize that reflects those values to make sure that they're deep in what we care about? So to me, it's no different in the private sector than it is in the public sector. That in fact, if you don't have those values of justice deep in your bones and in the makeup of your company, the makeup of your team, then you're really going to do yourself a disservice from an investment standpoint, because what you're going to do is invest in things that are not ultimately going to work for society, which is bad for your investors and bad for returns. But more than that, we're about impact and returns. And if you're not caring about the broad sense of impact and how it affects humans, the last thing I'll say is this: the whole reason that I got involved, I'm sure the reason that Gina cares about pollution and climate is about human suffering, avoiding human suffering, enabling people in our society and across the world to be healthy and happy and lead productive lives and not be sick and terrified and doing anything they can to avoid trouble. And that's why honestly, Wes, I don't think you get the right outcomes. And more than that, I don't think you get the right, you cannot scale at the level you want to if you're doing something that's unjust.
I'm glad that you take that approach and to your investment. And just to continue on the theme of environmental justice, had another question, but specifically about disaster recovery and just distributed solar and storage in Puerto Rico, and investing in that, and whether Congress should earmark funds, specifically FEMA should earmark funds for that as well. And so I'll just pass that to Gina.
Well, as you probably all know, Puerto Rico was even hit again a few months ago where they lost their electricity. It's very challenging. And of course, you know, FEMA is already responding, but the one thing that FEMA did very shortly after the Biden administration started up was that they've always been the emergency response people when there's a disaster. For the first time, they put $1 billion program aside that's not about response to disaster, but resiliency. And FEMA is one of the leads in working on the restoration of the entire electricity system in Puerto Rico, which will take time. It's a whole rethink, top to bottom. And I think the challenge there is that there's a challenge between building back quickly enough that you have a system in place and thinking it through with enough planning to make sure that renewable energy is going to get a significant place in that energy system. And that's what the discussion is all about now. And it's not, I don't think it's as much a question of whether we have the resources, because we're obligated to support that effort and move it forward. And I met with Secretary Granholm and some of her team to make sure that they've been looking with some of their resources at how to make sure we're making renewable energy a significant portion of the response there. So it is a difficult situation, but it's not a question of whether or not the resource is going to be available. We have to do that. It's a question of making sure that we plan it appropriately so that it has the resilience in the system that it needs, because they're relying right now on large utilities, fossil fuel utilities that go out all the time. And why aren't we thinking about much more decentralized opportunities, distributed energy, solar on rooftops, that can actually build you the resilience that you need?
Thank you. One last question here, and this is for both of you. The mid-market solar, commercial, and industrial scale, the mid-market solar is not growing fast enough to fill the need. So that includes commercial and industrial scale, so between 50 kilowatts and 5 megawatts to fill the need. And so one firm estimated $400 billion in unmet need. And so just want to know what Galvanize and the White House are doing to push the growth of distributed energy.
Oh, I guess it'll be White House. Very quickly. Well, you want to take it? You studied the plan. Well, one of the things we tried to do is, I think everybody got very animated about the Clean Energy Performance Partnership. That was, it's been called many different things, but it's always CEPP. How many different venues? I mean, really, variations on the theme. And certainly it was a program that we thought had enormous value. But when it was clear that that program was not going to pass muster, we started looking at how to invest in distributed energy more heavily. So if you look at this plan, it looks at investments in a couple of different ways that are directly benefited by a redistribution of funding. And one of them was consumer credits. One of them was distributed generation, including solar. Another was working with rural co-ops, who, Lord knows, have to get really a lot more renewable energy to lower the costs to the people who are poorest in our country and have to pay huge prices. So there is a lot in here that we hope will benefit and send the right signals that distributed generation is really.
So let me take off on what Gina said. And when you think about distributed generation, so that means a lot of people producing energy. and sending it into the grid. And then a lot of people storing energy and then selling it back into the grid when it's expensive. And a lot of people also, so the grid has to change and be a lot more flexible and adaptable. And you also, in order to do all those things, you have to track every electron so you can charge and so you can pay. So when you think about this from an investment standpoint, Wes, you're really talking about a completely new, much more advanced system involving a lot of new kind of software, data following, a whole new system. But the other thing that's really true about, so that's something that's a huge investment thing that has to happen. And that's very exciting and is going to enable a lot of things. And when you think about solar, and you think about how much we need to do if we're really going to take this to the percentages of energy generation we're talking about, you're talking about a lot of solar. And I can't remember who made this point earlier today, but in fact, that if you're doing, utility grade solar, huge solar arrays in the desert, that doesn't come without cost. That doesn't come without regulation, and it takes a lot of time. You know what we have a lot of? Roofs. We have roofs. You know what you don't have to permit? A roof, because it's already built. So when you think about, people love utility grade solar. It's very cheap. The two cheapest form of energy generation in the United States are wind and utility grade solar. But when you talk about it, that has a huge permitting problem. It's got a huge timing problem that you don't have in terms of rooftop solar. So there's a whole bunch of interplaying facts about permitting, about costs, and then about the ability to actually run this complicated system that does not look like 1900. Big, dumb generation with a one-way pipe to everybody's house. That is not where we're going. And if you think about it, that was the model for virtually every industry in the country. And that is a model which is going away. So this is a perfect example of the kind of interactive investment, technology, policy, and finance that is going to enable us to do new things and then export that around the world.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. Can we just get a round of applause for them both? Really great conversation. As we work to meet our pledge by 2030, and 10 years from now, 15 years from now, things will look very different. And how we maximize these public dollars in this infrastructure bill and distributed energy generation, and how we invest in communities. And so, just was a great conversation, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Wes.